join. And
okay, I'm going to go on mute for the moment, but we'll listen for you, okay?
Perfect. Yeah, you sound great. Your audio is perfect.
Great.
Is in Article 4 and primarily from two angles. One, from the angle of mitigation. It's among the 6 sectors that have been identified in the convention that have potential of mitigating climate change. And I think we all know that the agriculture, forestry, and other land use contributes almost a third of global emissions, and in some countries, in most of the countries in Africa, the largest emissions actually comes from the agriculture sector, and therefore it's very critical. Now it's on that, and then the second arm is treated from the adaptation perspective, because agriculture in the context of Africa is so critical because it forms most of the people's livelihoods is dependent on agriculture, and therefore agriculture is being, if affected by climate change, then it's going to affect a large population of the economy and the population in Africa. And it's on that basis that over the years attempts have been made to try and see how at the global level, agriculture can be treated so that it takes the significant role it plays in either as a source of emissions or affected by climate change. And it's on that basis that way back in Bali in 2007, agriculture was included in the what we call the bunker fuels, cooperative approaches, and it became very difficult because if you put agriculture, which is a livelihood issue, with bunker fuels, that's aviation and shipping emissions, then it's very difficult. And it took us a long time to decouple it until in 2011, when it was decoupled when we were in Durban, that we moved agriculture from the general discussions into the scientific, the body of the convention, which is a subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, SABSTA, so that we are able to discuss the science. And once we identify those areas, then we bring in the implementation, which is done by the subsidiary body on implementation. Now, and that's why it's critical that since 2011, it took us many years to get to the decision on agriculture, and that's why the Katowice joint work, the joint work on the Koroniva joint work on agriculture becomes very important, because it's a culmination of many years of discussions on how we could treat agriculture. And the Koroniva is important because it brings the two subsidiary bodies together to discuss issues of agriculture. It brings the science and it brings the implementation. So that whatever we discuss, the scientific part, then we should be able also to discuss how can we give effect to those ideas that are emerging. And as you realize, there are 6 topics under the Koroniva, and the other one, the key one is the first one, which is on modalities, for implementation of those topics that we discussed. And in Katowice, we actually had the first in-session workshop where the parties were engaged with the bodies, constituted bodies under the convention that are dealing with different aspects. That means the adaptation committee, the financial mechanisms, and all those technology mechanisms, so that we see what we are discussing, how can these bodies help countries to give effect to them, both at a national level and at a subnational level where communities are. And the subsequent topics on modalities, on the methods and approaches, for example, on adaptation mitigation, are critical, and those are going to form the basis of discussions during the coming session in June. In June, we're going to have to discuss two topics: the methods and approaches for adaptation, adaptation co-benefits and resilience, and the topic on soil carbon, soil health, and soil fertility. Both those two topics are so important to Africa. Why? Because adaptation is a priority for Africa. If we don't have proper methods that understand the special circumstances of Africa, then it means we may not actually capture what we're doing and the challenges thereof. And that's why we are making assessment of all those methods that are existing out there, and trying to say to what extent are they going to help Africa to be able to assess progress of whether they are adapting and building resilience or not. And that can also fit in the bigger picture, which I will be talking about Paris Agreement in terms of the global goal on adaptation. Then the second topic, which is the soil carbon, soil fertility, and soil health, I think is so critical because in all the declarations of our heads of states, particularly Abuja, it recognized that our soils are poor. And it did recommend that it obligated the member states, AU member states, to try as much as possible and increase the use of organic matter or fertilizer in their farms. And this gives us an opportunity now to look at what is the constraint of our soils, and from a scientific perspective, what can we do in order to build the soil health, so that they are able to increase the production, especially with increasing population and the vulnerability of our people. And therefore, the topics that we are discussing under the Koroniwe joint work on agriculture are critical to Africa because we were involved in designing them. And we think that as we continue discussing, and now that we brought the implementation part on it, we will be able to see to what extent the international instruments can help mobilize climate finance, technology development and transfer, and capacity building that will be able to be used by the countries in Africa. Now, coming to Paris Agreement and primarily the difference and how it helps to build the convention, is that I did say that the convention in its objective, it used the word not threaten food production. Now, the Paris Agreement went further in its preamble now, moved from food production actually to safeguarding food security. And that means it is now agriculture is receiving more recognition of its centrality. And in the purpose, which is Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, it actually makes reference to whatever you are doing in adaptation and mitigation, it should not threaten, again, food production systems. And therefore, that is a running theme in both the convention and the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to be under the convention. Now, what is important under that is this. If you look at the Paris Agreement, Article 2, Paragraph 1C, it says that we align climate finance with low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development strategies. And that is important in agriculture because in our case, agriculture is important in terms of adaptation. Agriculture is important in terms of mitigation because you can, as you do the adaptation, you can have mitigation co-benefits. And therefore, we need to take into account that agriculture is both a problem and is a solution in the climate debate. Now, to operationalize the Paris Agreement, the Katowice COP24 was looking at the rule book, and I'll just mention a few so that Ivan can pick up from there. The first one is the outcome of the Katowice is this: parties must, one, by 2020, formulate their mid-century long-term low emission and climate resilient development strategies. That means 2050, 2080 strategies. Now, what does that mean? It means that those strategies will kind of give a projection as to where the country wants to be in 50 years and using the nationally determined contributions every 5 years, that is communicated every 5 years, to see how, and therefore you're able to track how the country is moving to achieve that. And the second one is also in the 2020, the countries are supposed to update their nationally determined contribution, whether it was a 5-year or the 10-year, which is up to 2030. And therefore the year of 2020 is so critical that, one, the science that we're doing in agriculture must inform the long-term strategy. And number two, we must also update, the countries must update with best science their nationally determined contributions, which are instruments for which countries are going to contribute to that. Then the second point that I want to mention is on the global goal on adaptation, because this is a very important aspect. It was brought in, actually, a suggestion for its inclusion came from Africa, because we thought that if we have a global goal based on temperature, which is a mitigation oriented, then we needed some global goal on adaptation so that the two can be treated at the same level. And therefore, the question that arose from the rule book was, we don't have proper tools to track collective adaptation progress. How do you know that you are contributing or you're achieving the global goal on adaptation? Because adaptation, as we know, it's a localized and therefore a context specific, but we want to see how we can say, yes, in temperature, in terms of temperature, we are going below 1.5 degree or 2 degree, but in adaptation, what is the target? How do we know that we are building resilience? And there it means that there's an opportunity for scientists, CG and others, to work with us. And actually, in the rule book that we adopted in Paris, in Katowice, it was agreed, it invited scientists and other bodies to work with the adaptation committee in order to provide those tools. And I think that will be useful in terms of moving forward. Ivan.
Okay.
Excellent. Just a second, Ivan, if you do not mind, I see we have 26 people right now on the call, which is super. It means there are a few more people who have joined us. Shall I just say that was Dr. George who was speaking, more or less sort of capturing the overall evolution and going back from the convention up onto the Paris Agreement and then the targets moving forward to 2020. He did throw out so many things. I suspect that we would have a chance to come back to some of them, ask questions in case we need them. But he finished up with the science component, how critical that would be in terms of informing both the NDCs at country levels, informing the decisions moving forward. So I think that's obviously ties in well with what we should be able to have Ivan speak about right now with respect to the work that they're doing at the level of CIAT. Over to you, Ivan.
Okay, thank you, David. And welcome to those who have joined since we started. Again, my name is Evan Gervets, and I'm a senior scientist at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture based in Nairobi, Kenya, where George and I are right now. just a little bit about the center where I work to give some context for the perspective that I bring. We're an international research institution, part of the CGIAR, which is the largest consortium of agricultural research organizations globally. And although we're a research center, we really sit at the nexus of science and implementation. And I think that's important to point out, because that was one of the points that George was making in terms of the subsidiary groups that were coming together around this discussion of how do you bring the evidence and the science together with the implementation that's there. And that's really what we focus on, is bringing the evidence, making it practical, making it usable, and helping the partners that we work with, be it at the global level, be it at the national level, or really down into a Kenyan county or a state in Nigeria, helping them to implement the work that they want to do in line with the UNFCCC, the commitments that they've made and the agreements that come out of it. I also want to start by acknowledging a point that George made about agriculture being both a problem and a solution. That we certainly know that that climate change is already and certainly in the future will cause greater impacts to agriculture, and so it's a huge threat to the food security, as George was mentioning, to the production of agriculture. And Africa is really a hot spot for risk and vulnerability of climate change to agriculture. But at the same time, it contributes a good amount globally to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. So it's part of the problem that's causing it in the first place. And in Africa, it's really proportionally more, the agriculture sector is then, as George pointed out, than other countries around the world. This is when you both look at just agricultural production, but also bringing land use change in. George said globally it's about agriculture, land use and forestry contribute around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. In Africa is probably closer to pushing 2/3 of those, and in some countries even greater. So it's a major part of the problem. But on the other hand, I think we need to acknowledge that the major source of greenhouse gas emissions globally is not coming from Africa, but is coming from other countries globally. And so that creates a tension that George was talking about. So what we want to do at my organization, at our partner organizations in the CGIAR, and in the research program that David mentioned at the beginning, the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security, is bring the evidence to help bring clarity to some of these issues and to point to what some of the solutions can be. And then in addition to the evidence, the tools that can help our partners, as I mentioned, implement and operationalize the work that they want to do. So coming back to some of the specifics that George ended on and David teed up, that by 2020, there are some things that need to be done in terms of updating the NDCs that George mentioned to create the long-term plans, strategies that countries are aiming for in the long term, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to develop some of the tools for tracking adaptation progress, and that's a real challenge. Science can play a big role in doing this, and we're already doing some of this, but also see the work that needs to be done as we go into the future. I want to mention a few examples of the kind of work that we're doing as we think about how the research community and the science can bring this kind of evidence and tools to the partners that we work with, again, internationally, but I think very importantly at the national level, that's really where the rubber starts hitting the tarmac, and then as you get down subnationally into implementation on the ground. In a set of countries globally, more than 30 countries globally and more than 15 countries here in Africa, we've been developing a sort of situation analysis for looking at climate and agriculture in different countries. And this helps to provide some baseline evidence for informing the updating of the nationally determined contributions, long-term strategies of the countries. These we call climate smart agriculture country profiles. This is looking at the context for agriculture in the country, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from agriculture, as well as looking at other land use change. Looking at the vulnerabilities and providing the assessments, doing the modeling to say what crops are likely to be most impacted by climate change as we go into the future, and which crops are going to be most resilient, that maybe you can keep doing the same thing and really you're going to be fine. I like to say that I don't think everything's going to be a loser in terms of climate change. Some things can be a winner, and then certainly we're going to have to adjust in some ways. And so in these profiles, we also identify what some of the interventions are that can help the agriculture sector to adapt to climate change, as well as what are some of the opportunities for getting these mitigation co-benefits that George was talking about. I mentioned these as climate smart agriculture country profiles, and I don't think we've really defined that yet here in this context. So this term of climate smart agriculture is something that we focus on quite a bit at CIAT, where I work, and in the CGIAR with the Climate Change Agriculture and Food Security Research Program, where this is looking at how we can get multiple benefits from the interventions that we bring to agriculture in terms of, one, increasing the productivity, and as George mentioned, anything that we do, we have to make sure that food security is maintained as we go into the future. And so maintaining productivity and increasing in Africa is important. But at the same time, in climate smart agriculture, we're also looking at how the interventions can improve the resilience and help agriculture adapt to the impacts of climate change. So we know the impacts are big, the risks are major for how climate change can affect agriculture now and more going into the future. But there are things that can be done that can help build that resilience and help agriculture adapt. And then third, to look at bringing in the co-benefit of mitigation, that often by increasing productivity and improving resilience, you can also get benefits that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And those can then help countries to move towards the commitments that they have in terms of mitigation, while still maintaining the productivity and adaptation that's there. So there's really a triple win of increasing productivity, improving resilience, and adapting, and then third, mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a co-benefit at the same time. And so in these profiles, these climate smart agriculture profiles that I was mentioning in these countries, we're looking at what are the opportunities to do that. And then that information can be brought into the long-term strategies I was mentioning, looking at what are some of the really vulnerable value chains and commodities that are in the agriculture sector in specific countries, because each country is different. And we really need to look at what are the issues in each country, but then what can be done? What are the opportunities to turn agriculture into a winner in that country and not into a loser, at the same time looking at where we can get wins in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, while also the other wins of increasing productivity and addressing the resilience issues. So in these countries, these documents are being taken up by national governments and partners and being integrated into these kind of plans. Now, that's just the first step in terms of understanding the situation. You then need to figure out what is it that you really should be doing, where should the funding be going to? And so we're also working with countries to develop what we call climate smart agriculture investment plans. These can go along with climate smart agriculture strategies that some countries have, and we've helped support them in developing these strategies, where the kind of information that I just described, we'll work with them to bring that in and develop the strategy for the country. And then in developing the climate smart agriculture investment plan, this is much more going towards programming of funds and the implementation of specific projects on the ground. So we start with the situation analysis of what are the big issues in the country, bringing the evidence to that. But it's not just us doing it. We very much feel that we shouldn't be the ones coming and telling countries what to do, but it's more about working with the stakeholders in the countries, the national governments, civil society, private sector, having them come to the table, understanding the issues, identifying a long list of what are some of the things that should be done in the country. But we know that all the money is not there right now, and so we have a process we work through with our partners in these countries to then filter that down to a short list using criteria that are important for the country, bringing the evidence and the science to inform how different kinds of investments score against those criteria, and then facilitating and working with the stakeholders to identify a portfolio, a smaller portfolio, investment portfolio that is of high priority for them in that country. So then you have a more manageable set of investments that could be made. But then a step further needs to be done in terms of designing out those investments. It's one thing to say, here's what needs to be done, but then more evidence needs to be brought in to what would these programs look like on the ground? How should they be structured? Who are the partners that should be working on the implementation of these programs in the countries? And this is both, it can be government partners, civil society, but then certainly, again, the private sector, we feel, plays a strong role here in how climate change should be addressed in the agriculture sector in African countries, and be a part of the investments that are made there. And so that climate considerations and climate smart agriculture are mainstreamed into how business is done, as well as how government implements the policies and programs that they promote. And then finally, once you have a program and the funding to implement it, you need the tools to monitor, measure, report, and verify what is being done in the countries. That especially when climate finance is involved, that finance is coming from countries around the world, putting money to say, we want to be solving this problem, but they want to have accountability for how their money is being used and what's being done with it. And so in these countries, there's a real need, as George mentioned, for the tools for how do you track and how do you measure, verify, and then report on the work that is being done. And so we're working with these countries along with our partners in, for example, my colleagues at the World Agroforestry Center here in Nairobi, working with countries around Africa in designing climate smart agriculture, monitoring frameworks for measurement, reporting, and verification, as I was mentioning. So at a high level, what are all the issues that need to be addressed? What's sort of your theory of change for how these address the issues? But then really getting down to the practical matters of what are the kinds of indicators that should be measured, and then how do you actually measure those? And so I think, as George mentioned, there's really a need for some work to be done, and we're looking at this in terms of how do you go and measure resilience and adaptation on the ground, and have the kind of tools where you can be going into projects, looking at what's done, interviewing people and tracking the projects of those projects to be able to report on that adaptation. So there's a lot of good work that's been done to now, but there's also a lot of work still to be done. And then finally, I just want to wrap up my comments by saying that finance is a huge issue for this, and there is a lot of money that's being put out there, but there's also a lot more that's needed. And we're working on providing the evidence both for why that money can be spent in a good way, but also, as I was mentioning here, helping countries to design what are the kinds of interventions that money would want to go towards. So we often call it bankable projects, to bring the evidence to show this project is going to have the effect that it says it is, and that it's designed in a way that can be sustainable and is going to be successful when it's implemented. And then again, to show that the project is set up in a way that it's going to be able to show with evidence that it accomplishes what it needs. And when you do this, then we can help unlock the finance that's out there for the African countries that's there. And so in doing this, I'll end here by saying that there's a real need, and what we're working on is building the capacity of national governments, of partners in the countries and even within the countries, to be able to use the kind of information, the evidence that's out there in the design of the projects, their programs, and then, as we're mentioning, the policies and commitments, NDCs, and the mid and long-term plans, so that they can do that themselves. We can be there to help, but really, ultimately, the countries and our partners are the ones that need to be doing it. So with that, I'll stop there, and David, pass it back to you, and we're happy to take questions and have a discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you so much, George. Really appreciate the presentation. Plenty of stuff for the journalists who may be on the webinar this morning. I don't know exactly how to summarize this, but I'd say George has actually emphasized the criticality of agriculture to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, which is a convention. He has emphasized how much this is also central to the Paris Agreement in 2015, and how much this is also important going forward, meaning particularly when we're talking about the 2020 targets, which were partly discussed at the last UN meeting in Poland. I'd have to say that Evan has actually emphasized the work that they are doing in their center, the criticality of science to all of this. Thrown out so many other concepts here as well. And I think this is pretty interesting for some of the journalists who are here. I suspect that they should have plenty of questions. I have some questions, but I think it would be important for us to let the journalists speak. But meantime, Evan, could you just say what are some of the countries that you're working in so that some of the journalists here know exactly, because you did not mention which countries you're working in the region.
Yes, we're working in quite a few countries across Africa. I'll try to get most of them, and there's various levels that we work in some of the countries. I mean, some were at a higher level in terms of providing the situation analysis of a climate smart agriculture country profile. Others were diving down deeper and even getting down to the ground and studying the implementation of certain projects. So, for example, we've done quite a bit of work in Kenya. That's where I'm based. Here, and I'll mention one more thing, just that in counties here in Kenya, we're taking the same kind of approach down to the county level and helping them profile their climate risk across 4 key value chains, 4 key commodities in each county, and identifying what specific interventions they can be investing in those counties, and then building their capacity to develop the programs for doing that. We're also doing work in Ethiopia, again, both at the national level, and now we're starting work in the bean value chain to support the understanding of the risks and the interventions that can be taken there. In Tanzania, we've worked quite a bit across from the national government, again, down lower, developing a climate smart agriculture country profile in collaboration with the government there. Supporting with many others, including George, the establishment of the Tanzania Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance in the country, which brings together stakeholders at the national level. And then working with partners at CARE International, Wageningen University of the Netherlands, and Sokoine University in Tanzania to study a model of bringing a village savings and loan association together with a farmer field business school to scale up climate smart agriculture, and that can be a model for implementation, so studying that. We also have done work in Rwanda, where we have a large project on climate services. We're working with the Met Department to bring climate information and weather forecasts to farmers through information and communication technologies and the extension system there. Working in Uganda there on profiling climate smart agriculture. We've done work in Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, Lesotho, in West Africa, working in Mali and Cote d'Ivoire on planning for climate smart agriculture investments there, working in Niger on developing a climate smart agriculture profile, working in Nigeria, where I've noticed that Michael has made a comment here that I'll mention, where we are working with the Nigerian incentive-based risk-sharing system for agricultural lending, NERSL, which is a spin-off from the central bank, to help them understand the risks that are in the different key value chains that they work in, and what some of the climate smart agriculture interventions could be there, among other work in Nigeria. Benin, we've done work. So there's quite a few countries around Africa where we are, but those are some of the major ones, Ghana, that I can mention.
Excellent,
David,
great.
Can I add, David, something?
Just a second, Dr. George, if you don't mind, because I see there's a question here from one of the journalists, and I think it's important that we just pick up on some of the questions. In part because we've had 48 minutes of introductory statements, and then so I think let's spend the next 45 actually listening to the journalist. I think you've thrown a few concepts out there, some of them not explained. Of course, these are, I'd say, very broad topics. Even if we had the entire year, we might not be able to go through some of them. So you've just thrown a few things out there, and if journalists do have questions with respect to them, they could ask. But I have this question, which is from Emmanuel Enebeli. He's asking, with the increase in dwindling land in Africa, meaning that with land dwindling in Africa, how will reduction in farmland burning affect food production? George, you can take that. Ivan, you can take that.
I mean, I think that land issues and land use change is a huge issue for agriculture, and that land use changes is one of the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation and other types of land use change. It also is that we only have so much land and good land to produce agriculture on, and we should be making the most of it that's there. To me, one of the big issues is you just look at productivity in Africa and how much lower it is than the rest of the world. And I don't want to be so simple, but I think one of the main things Africa needs to do is work on just increasing the productivity and being more efficient with its use of resources. I'll say that fertilizer is not necessarily all good and can be a big part of the problem, but it also can be part of the solution, especially here in Africa where there's such low use of fertilizer and inputs. And so the right use and really being able to target the right fertilizer, the right timing of it, and the right amount, et cetera, is important and can actually be a huge benefit for increasing productivity and avoiding having to go clear more land for agriculture if we can produce more with what we have. But another one of the big issues that there is the land degradation. And I think that we've been overusing the land that's there and going into new land. And so I'd say that we really need to focus on how we can restore the soils. George was mentioning that soil carbon, among other aspects of soils, are very important to address. Not just because carbon is from a mitigation standpoint, but really because it can improve the fertility of the soil and then ultimately the productivity.
Thank you, Ivan. George, you wanted to say something, please.
Yeah, that is from the science. From the policy perspective is you go back to the Malabo Declaration, where the heads of states made some certain pronouncements and decisions, and one of the decisions was to task the NEPAD under the CADEP program to do two things. One, to climate proof the CADEP program, because at the time when it was designed, it never looked into the climate change aspect. And therefore, with climate change now, we need to see how countries address that. And the second is to help CADEP, working with the African Union, to help countries develop bankable projects for climate financing from GCF. And in this regard, the NEPAD, with support from the German government, the GIZ, it is working in 12 countries to support access to climate finance from GCF. The countries that have been that NEPAD is working in Southern Africa, we have Botswana, we have Malawi, we have Mozambique, we have South Africa, and we have Zambia.
Great.
In East Africa, we have Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. In Central Africa, we have Cameroon and Congo Republic. And in West Africa, we have Ghana and Niger.
Excellent. I have to say that, George, when you speak, I know you speak as, you use a lot of concepts, CADEP. It'll be important that at some point you can explain that. Obviously, that's the comprehensive plan for agriculture. It's an African Union policy framework, but it's important that you can explain that a little bit. When you throw out concepts like GCF, what do they mean? Green Climate Fund. It's important that you try to explain that a little bit, because some of the journalists here, some of them may be very experienced. They may master these concepts. Some may not. Because I have a question here from Lillian, for instance, which says terminologies matter. And in this case, is climate change still appropriate? Or still appropriate, rather? It's more of a comment, rather, because I think Lillian Kambirigi goes on to say what's that really resonate right now are climate adaptation. All right. I don't know if you want to react to that. Obviously, for Africa, adaptation is pretty critical. I suspect if that's a way to put it.
Yeah. No. Thanks, Dave. But I think we must look at climate change. It's not just adaptation. Climate change is both adaptation and mitigation.
Absolutely.
And number two. Climate change, for us to address climate change, it requires a global response, because the small thing that you do in one country, the air doesn't discriminate. It goes across and affects everyone. And therefore, we need that concerted efforts. And it's on that basis, under the Paris Agreement, that countries voluntarily put out what they are going to do through their nationally determined contributions, which is normally called NDCs.
Absolutely.
And you look at the national determined contributions of the African countries, they have both adaptation component and mitigation component. And in fact, one of the sectors which appears in both adaptation and mitigation in most of this national determined contribution is agriculture. Now, yes, adaptation is a priority for Africa, but we have also a responsibility to contribute to the global good by ensuring that we don't take a trajectory that is going to increase emissions, but we manage our development in a manner that is going to contribute sustainability.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, George. I'm glad that you emphasize that point. Adaptation is important, mitigation is important. I totally agree with you. And our reporters should be able to master both concepts, or should be interested in both concepts, and particularly if they are covering agriculture, because they have a bearing on both. So I totally agree with you. I have here a question from Emmanuel. I don't know what country Emmanuel it's from, but he says, do you know what sort of policies have been recently implemented? Could you give an example? I'm not particularly sure what he means by policies here. I wish the question could be a little bit more, could have more details to that. Is it policies with respect to some of the bankable, I'm not particularly sure. Is it some of the bankable projects that you mentioned, even with respect to the work that you're doing in helping to build investment portfolios at country levels on climate? I'm not particularly sure. It's a little broad. If George, if Emmanuel, if you can get me, if you can also speak, or you could just perhaps elaborate a little bit on the question. But I have clearer questions here. Other questions which are a little bit more clear, to put it that way. This is a question from, and I say we have quite some comments coming in as well. I think Lillian is saying, we know industrial lobbies to which governments are connected do not allow organic farming to develop. Farmers also want rapid profit. How does the CGIAR deal with this? Did he get that, Evan? No.
I think, the role of organic farming, I think, is the question.
No, I think there's a political element to that, which is the fact that the lobbyists, lobbyists were not connected to government. Those supporting government do not allow for organic farming to develop. So, yeah, I suspect you could speak from a scientific or on what work you're doing on organic farming, I suspect.
Sure, yeah. I think that organic farming can play an important role in climate change and agricultural issues in Africa. I also think that there's some challenges there in that we need to be increasing productivity, and that there can be ways to do that in a sustainable way. So I would say we definitely want to be sustainable, but there may be some need for increases of especially chemical fertilizer inputs where there's not enough organic inputs to support the agricultural system. And some of the research that I've seen coming out, for example, soil carbon is a very important point. It's important, one, there's evidence that it can provide some mitigation benefits, although you got to be in the right places, you're putting carbon into the soil. But I think as important, if not more important, it can provide improved water cycling in the soil. It can hold more water in the soil. It can improve soil fertility and the cycling of nutrients to get into the crops. Now, to increase your soil carbon, the way you do that is by putting we call organic matter, basically the green mass, what you see, what's left over from corn, maize when you grow it. You would put that back into the soil, and that can improve the soil carbon that's in there and be part of an organic farming system. You also put manure into the soil. But now the problem becomes when you need to feed the cows the maize, the leftover maize, and you can't put that back into the soil. And the evidence I've seen is that organic farming alone often cannot produce enough of the green material to be able to have the system work properly, especially when you have degraded soil. So that we do need to look at an integrated approach, integrated soil fertility management, where we balance the organic inputs with, it could be some chemical fertilizer inputs, but again, done in the right way, not done in the way where you're washing fertilizers off down into the streams and ruining your water quality, creating greenhouse gas, nitrogen emissions, this type of thing. So I think it can be part of the solution, but I also think we need to be looking in a holistic way and working with governments to bring them the evidence to say, here are the solutions, that work for sustainability first and foremost. And again, organic can be a part of that. And it can also be a higher value, that if you can certify it and you can find the right markets, that can be part of income generating livelihood benefits for the farmers that are there. But I'm worried that if you said blanket, organic needs to be the solution, then there's some challenges that can come, and we need to be looking in this integrated, holistic way.
Excellent, Evan. Shall I just say to the journalists who may be interested in agri-inputs, organic issues overall, please feel free to also email Sean or any other specialist in these issues in CIAT or any CG system in your country to follow up on this if you want to, if this is something that you're interested in reporting on. I have a question here from Charity Nwati. It doesn't say the country. I would appreciate if you could also indicate where you are participating from. That would enable our experts here to perhaps point you to very concrete data on your country. If they have it in hand, if they don't have it, it could perhaps guide you to where you could go get that. But the questions, it's generic, of course. It's with respect to Africa spends 35 billion annually to import food. What are the implications of this? This is more or less a policy question. Would you want to take this little quick, George? We have 30 more minutes, and it will be important that we can answer and even go to the comments of some of the colleagues. Over to you, George.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, it's true. Kenya, the Africa food import budget is huge. And I think that has been recognized by our heads of state, and also more importantly, the African Development Bank, where it has put aside huge resources to work with the governments to make sure that more investment is done in agriculture, so that we reduce the import budget. It's recognized, and something is being done by our institutions.
Super. Evan, can you say how science can help in this, and what journalists can go ahead and report on in terms of some of the scientific solutions that you're providing to be able to cut down on this level of import very quickly?
Yes. So as I was mentioning, there's going to be winners and losers in the climate change context in the future. And we've been using some global modeling that's out of the International Food Policy Research Institute to look at how climate change will affect trade balances, assuming different scenarios of the future. And so when I was mentioning the situation analysis, it's one of the pieces of information that we bring in, that we say, okay, here we know today what the trade balance is on different commodities, whether you're importing or exporting. And in the future, how will that change? Because some countries may be able to produce easier in the future, others harder. And what this does is it helps to point to where the opportunities and where the problems might be in the future, and to better target them. Because in the future, there may be an opportunity for African countries to take advantage of other countries having problems producing some commodities and focus on those as an export crop. But then also flag if there's a major food security crop that you're already importing a bit, and that your import balance is going to get even worse in the future, that you need to be really investing in maybe improving production in the country, or at least figuring out how you're going to deal with that. So there's some approaches and information that we can bring to address that. Excellent.
And Charity was from Kenya. She was asking the question from Kenya. There is a question here from Lillian. Agree on the reported, meaning she's agreeing. Journalists do play a part in tools for tracking, measure, report, verify. Unfortunately, budgets sacrifices element. Well, more or less a comment, right? I don't know if you have a reaction to that, real quick.
No. I think she's mixing two issues there. I think. Okay. Yeah. But in terms of what we're talking about is the indicators for measuring that if you put in this amount of money for people to adapt, after a number of years, are you able to track whether those people have adapted or not? Those are the indicators we're looking at, and then make sure that those indicators are embedded into the national monitoring frameworks, because every year countries produce their annual status report, and if your indicators on climate resilience are not included in national processes, then it means they don't exist, and therefore you have no mechanism through which you can track that. And therefore it's important that, one, we come up, develop tools, scientists help countries and parties to develop tools, which tools can be tested and incorporated into their national frameworks to feed into the global framework.
Excellent, great. Shirley Anderson, as perhaps climate smart agriculture, which you talked a little bit about even, and net biodiversity gain go hand in hand, e.g. maintaining healthy insect populations, other complementary plants and animal species, biodiverse agriculture. So the question is perhaps climate, you understood that, right?
Yeah, I think, and I'll say that I see climate smart agriculture as quite a broad concept. I think I would put it this way, that I heard this from the chief scientist at USAID, Rob Bertram, saying that really climate smart agriculture is just smart agriculture, but you bring a climate lens to it, and you understand what are the climate risks and what are the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming out, and then you design your interventions from there. Now, diversification and the role of biological diversity, I think, plays a huge role in this. You've got pollinators, you've got insects that can play a role in protecting your plants against other insects that can hurt the plants. There's also the role of agrobiodiversity, that if we only have one variety of crop that we're promoting as climate changes, that variety may not be so suitable. And so we need to have the wide variety, both from traditional breeding approaches. I would also include potentially other modern techniques for improving the genetics in various ways, and to be able to select for drought tolerance and these kind of varieties, on the one hand, going on the more technological direction, but also local land races that farmers have saved for years and years and years and maybe are not in the formal seed systems. All of these are important for the biodiversity that's there, and then, for climate smart agriculture, resilience, and also can be for mitigation also. But then also you look at broader nature conservation and biological diversity, that conservation of forests is important for mitigation as well as for biodiversity. And climate smart agriculture would say we need to be more efficient with our resources, grow more food with less on less land, and protect those areas so we're not going in and causing greenhouse gas emissions from deforesting the Congo or wherever it is. So I absolutely think that biodiversity in many different ways is an important part of climate smart agriculture.
Thank you, Ivan. I have Marcus Simiri, who just indicated that a recent research in Nigeria indicated that, of course, there was the long-held assumption that energy was the highest contributor to global warming in Nigeria. It's not true. It is agriculture. And I think both of you have emphasized that already. And I think that it's one of the take-home. Obviously, the facts have been out for a long time, but it's important that journalists recognize that agriculture, it's one of the contributing sectors for emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly in Africa. And they can investigate this if they want to go out and do some other reports. I have Mike, sorry, just a second. It's Ross. It doesn't have the full name right here, but it says climate smart agriculture seems to be one of the main ways to adapt to climate change. How do you make climate smart agriculture and other solutions central to global international meetings and make it accessible to journalists? It seems that there is so much work going on yet underreported. And this is Rosalia, rather, from Nairobi.
Yeah, I think I fully agree in the sense that the media needs to be involved in this, but unfortunately, the way the international discourse is organized is such that first is parties, which is countries, and then the rest you join in. But there are two things I want to mention on that. One is that the concept of climate smart agriculture has had problems in the negotiations. I recall when I was chairing the meeting on agriculture, and then we had in the Hague the global meeting from which the definition of climate smart agriculture came about from FAO. Then it received complete resistance, and that's why it never appears in all the documentation we have from the UNFCCC in their negotiations. And I also I agree with Ivan. It makes sense. It's a smart agriculture, but you are bringing the climate angle. But some people don't like it that way, and that's why others have adopted this word agroecology. So you have somebody now saying climate smart agriculture, another one saying agroecology, and now us as negotiators, we now don't know which one we will use, because it looks the terminologies are changing faster than the policy is being formulated. Now, and that's why in most of the projects, if you go to the Green Climate Fund website, most of the climate finance that has been projects that have been approved on agriculture, they use climate resilient more than the climate smart, simply because of the way agriculture has been defined within the convention and in the Paris Agreement, with emphasis more on adaptation part and therefore the resilience part, and then mitigation being a co-benefit because agriculture goes to the heart and the livelihoods of the people. Now, in terms of the current work that we're doing under the UNFCCC is, for example, one, in June, we're going to have discussions on the Coronilla Joint Work on Agriculture on the topic of methods and approaches for assessing adaptation co-benefits and resilience, and also on soil carbon, soil health, and soil fertility. And the in-session workshops are going to be open to all parties and also observers, which means including media. And therefore, we would encourage the media, and particularly those from Africa, to work very closely with their relevant ministries of environment, which are responsible for climate, so that they are included in the national delegations, and so that they are able to participate in this. I recall when I was working with COMESA, we had a program where we are supporting journalists to attend the meetings, and I know of some colleagues from journalists who have since gotten support from elsewhere now to continue with this. So I would really encourage our media people to take interest in this, because it's important. It's not just because it's a global issue, it affects us at the local level, and therefore their interaction at an international level can help our people understand what we need to do in order to enhance our people's adaptation capability.
Super, and I'm glad that you raised the point of the local component of this. It's pretty, the national aspect of it is very important for the audience here this morning, because most of them are reporters working on these issues at the national level. And as much as it is important for them to be able to do their, well, you're right that understanding the global context obviously helps them to better report the stuff in country. Shall I just say that someone
quickly, David,
yes.
Can I just share one thing? I just want to say that I mentioned these climate smart agriculture country profiles. And here's an example for Mozambique. They're for over 15 countries throughout Africa. And it's quite accessible. These giving sort of infographics, and here showing the level of greenhouse gas emissions. That agriculture contributes 27%, land use 59%. So over 75% coming from those two alone. What are the impacts? And 25 pages that you can read and really understand the context. It's supposed to be accessible for this kind of audience, a policymaker as well as a journalist. And then we've summarized this across 31 countries globally to kind of demystify climate smart agriculture. We launched this at the UNFCCC COP24 in Katowice with the World Bank as a partner on this. And this summarizes kind of what is climate smart agriculture and what are some major take-home messages. So I can share links to these in the chat box, and this might help again, kind of demystify what this is. And then in a country, what does it mean for Mozambique? What does it mean for Senegal? What does it mean for Kenya, et cetera?
You read my mind. Even please put the link right there in the chat box so that everyone can have access to it. I think that's pretty important. There's Lillian who totally agreed with you, George. She said, thanks for recalling the origins of climate smart agriculture. It was a tough global debate. I have a question here from Jacqueline Ogalia. She's from Kenya. She says, thank you for the great insight. How do we promote organic farming to contribute to the food security aspect? As often, organic farming is mostly concerned with the quality aspect of food security, but limited output. Any quick reaction to that? If you did not fully understand the question, we could always ask Jacqueline to rephrase, but I'm reading more or less what she said. How do we promote organic farming to contribute to food security aspects of availability?
A quick one. For the projects that I'm involved in under the NEPAD, one of the key intervention areas is increasing the organic matter and more of, which means increasing the soil carbon using the manures and all that. So it was already an identified area of interest in most of the countries that we are working in. Maybe Ivan can add something.
I mean, I think one of the challenges with organic farming is that there's often, it needs a price premium. And you see in the US and Europe, that's sort of the business model for organic farming is this, people pay a bit more for it. So that requires certification, and it also requires a market to tap into. Now, there certainly are export markets that want more organic in Europe, maybe the US if it can make it that far, but certainly in Europe. And I think that to some degree developing in Africa, I think some of the health issues even can be an entry point where we know some of the challenges with increased pesticide use coming up more and more here. And I'll say that for myself, I go to the store and I even have a relationship with a farmer I've found where we can buy organic and feel better about feeding it to myself and my kids. And now I think, that can become part of the broader climate change in climate smart agriculture story. But I think that, looking at that health entry point can help with bringing and mainstreaming it. But again, the certification issues and the business model issues, I think, can be a challenge when it takes a price premium for it to work economically.
Excellent. I'll say that we have like 13 minutes to wrap up, and we do have quite some comments as well that have come in. I haven't read all the comments. Agroforestry is the agricultural use of trees and considered one of the sustainable uses of land. This is just a statement coming in from Mike, not Mike in Nigeria, I'd have to say that. And initially I'd had a comment here, I did not read it, but it's from Thomas Askukovec. And apologies if I get the name wrong, in part because it's not all spelled out. It says we've launched carbon farming, Austria, conservation farming, and climate smart agriculture at Agri-Technica back in 2017. Since quite some time, we are rather active in several countries across Africa. We substitute fertilizers by recycling tractors, exhaust fumes, HC and CO2 fertilization, dust. I think this is just more or less information with respect to what they're doing. It's not really a question in a sense. So I'm not going to be able to ask our panelists here to be able to react to that. And by the way, Evan has also sent out the link. So colleagues, please feel free to grab that link. I'd also have to say that having been a reporter myself, just to inject a personal perspective here, these reports have incredible amount of storylines. And for those of you who are getting into your news meetings this morning and wondering what is it that I could write about, what is it that I could suggest to the editor to have in the news paper tomorrow, you could go through this if you're in Mozambique, where there is already work done by CIAT. You could pick up a lot that you could put in the news tomorrow and get a few sources to be able to beef that up and get a story. And this is what this whole thing is all about, right? This whole exercise is all about. We would be rounding up soon. I don't have any questions anymore. Well, Thomas here says again, it is a question. Have you ever considered to recycle or rather, have you ever considered the recycle of exhaust emissions in agriculture as fertilizer substitute?
So say exhaust emissions as fertilizer subsidy?
Fertilizer substitute to fertilizers.
I'd say myself not, but I would be very interested to learn more about how that can be done. And I think we need to be thinking innovative with the solutions that we bring. I think, you know, mechanization is something that's important for African agriculture, and I think we need to figure out a way and see how that can be climate smart. I mean, can we have, you know, climate smart tractors that we bring in? And again, you know, I think focusing on increasing productivity while we're improving resilience and mitigating it and avoiding more land use change and deforestation is important. So as that can play a role, I think that's fantastic. And looking at ways that even tractors can be shared amongst farmers and help them improve the management of their land. And again, I think that they can be climate smart. For example, you could put a fertilizer sensor we were talking about on the tractor and be targeting where fertilizer is laid down. In the US, there's some new technology that's just coming out where they can sense weeds and only spray the very single weed at a very micro level. And so you're reducing your pesticide use, but still addressing the issue that's there. It's not organic, but at least it's moving, you know, the conventional agriculture in a way that's making it more climate smart, and then also has other benefits like health benefits, etc. But I'm intrigued by the
right.
question.
So Thomas, feel free to get back to Ivan at any point if you want to have any further discussions. I suspect they'll be available soon after this. Lillian Kabirigi from Kenya says it's not so easy to request government delegations to include journalists in some of these trips to UN meetings. And that, of course, is still emphasizing that it's important to get journalists on board, which I do not disagree. But I think it's always important for us to ask ourselves the independence that we as media people should have. It's in question every single time someone else pays your bills to participate in these meetings. And so the question becomes, how do we then go there? And most of the newsrooms cannot pay for that. And so you end up having organizations then take journalists to some of these meetings. So they are critical, but there are so many other issues that have to be considered, by the way. Shall I just say that Internews does take such a huge delegation to every annual climate meeting. The last in Poland, I think there were 20 journalists from Internews. And these are opportunities that are open to all journalists in case you want to participate. Thomas, again, just sent this message, but I suspect, again, it's just informational than a question, which is HC plus CO2 fertilization does stimulation of hydrocarbon bacteria, which has shown extraordinary results in semi-arid areas, amazing soil upgrading, and that they cooperate with universities in Morocco. So I suspect this is just a piece of information more than a question. So we only have 8 minutes. Shall we just say to our two panelists, and in case we do not have any questions from our colleagues, that beginning with you, Ivan, what is the point that you would like journalists to take home? Maybe just one or two that you'd like journalists to take home based on today's webinar.
Yeah, sure. I think one is, and George maybe can elaborate on this a bit, but that agriculture really had not found its place in the UNFCCC negotiations and the way that countries then deal with that. And so I think a huge breakthrough has happened over the last couple of years. And that's a huge opportunity for Africa. And also I want to give a lot of credit to George and his colleagues on working on this specific issue to bring clarity to how climate is addressed. I don't know how much people realize that it was a real challenge to address this. And so we see now, from our perspective, an opportunity, as I say, we sit between research and implementation to now explicitly be working on these issues coming out of the Paris Agreement, the Coroniva joint work plan, etc., for us to be bringing the evidence to the UNFCCC and to be working with countries. And so I think the second point I want to make is that I think the time is now. We know that climate is already impacting us. it's important what's going on with the U.S., with the UNFCCC and those processes, but governments we see are already moving forward with how climate and agriculture is addressed in Africa. That when you look at the vulnerabilities, agriculture is one of the most, if not the most vulnerable sector for Africa to address in terms of climate change. But we know that there are also solutions, and that bringing this kind of evidence to government policies and then to the design of programs is really important. But we see now a lot of progress being made from the research community. We have had a lot of work to do, still a lot of work to be done, but how do we translate the evidence that's there into something that's actually useful for a government decision maker, and then helping them to design these bankable projects, which then can help unlock the climate finance and other money that's out there. That a lot of the development assistance is even moving to climate finance now, because they're saying, okay, we know we need to do this, rather than just giving it in a normal way, we're going to give it through climate. So now they need to show we can help bring the evidence. We're doing that, working with the countries, and the opportunity is here now for countries to move forward with these plans and really to make a difference, to safeguard themselves, their people from the climate impacts, but also play a role in helping to mitigate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their perspective.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, for me, a number of things. One is I would like the media to write a little more about agriculture and climate change, and particularly the uniqueness in terms of Africa, given the livelihood dependence and the gender dimension, because agriculture in Africa is mainly women who do a lot of work, and since gender and climate change has become a substantive agenda item under the UNFCCC, we'll be able to demonstrate how Africa can, in fact, if investment was put in agriculture, would be able to demonstrate how to deal with gender issues in that context. So for me, I would encourage that the media, I'm happy to work with them, because under the team that I lead on agriculture in the Africa group of negotiators, we are very particular in the messaging, so that when we go to the UN meetings, we have already a common Africa position that we are advancing. We are going to have a meeting in April, preparatory meeting for the African group of negotiators on agriculture and the gender negotiators, where we work normally with the CCAFS and the CG. To help us generate and collect the relevant evidence. And that meeting is going to be very important, because we bring more than 40, 50 scientists, experts from across Africa, all the 5 sub-regions of Africa, in order to think through and agree on what are the key messages that should inform the Africa common position. And we hope that the media will be able to work with us so that we have that message ahead, because the point is there is more money for forests, there's more money for energy, and there is less money for agriculture, and yet agriculture is the most important for us. And therefore, if we can work with the media to get this message out, I think we're going to make a very big difference in after June.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. Deeply appreciate all the insight. I have a couple of takeaways. Obviously, many things that have been raised: the criticality of agriculture to climate change, the climate convention, that's the UNFCCC. It has progress up until the 2015 Paris Accord, where agriculture is also central. And obviously, if the journalists are asking themselves why more focus on agriculture, it is also because it is such a very vast sector in almost all our economies. And so that relationship with climate is pretty critical. So I suspect that with all of what George has given as an origin of the discussion on climate and the link with agriculture and the link with climate, up until where we stand right now, you have an insight right now with respect to what work is being done at the level of the convention, the Paris Agreement, and the future targets with respect to 2020 and even the 50-year plans that every country is expected to develop. The importance of science was emphasized by our colleague, Ivan, from CIAT. So many solutions out there. We did move on to talk a lot about organic agriculture. A lot of the colleagues were very interested in understanding some of these issues, which is important. And with respect to the takeaways, it's the wish of George to see more of the media participate in framing or developing the narrative and the messaging for Africa's position in these negotiations. Because as he says, even though agriculture is pretty critical, forest energy still has more money than agriculture. So hopefully some of you or most of the journalists who have participated, you've been able to take away something productive, something that a lead that can enable you to be able to do maybe a report tomorrow, in the next week, or in the next month, in your paper, in your radio, in your TV station. But of course, this was never meant to be a discussion which was going to stop this morning. No. It was just meant to obviously throw a few things out there, and there have been many things that have been thrown out there this morning with respect to the policy frameworks at the global, regional, and country level, with respect to the climate work that CIAT is doing at the country level, and with respect to all the other concepts that touch between touch on the relationship between mitigation and adaptation and agriculture. And so the intention is just get the discussion started, hoping that you could all continue your homework. If you want to stay on this beat, you would soon realize that there's plenty of homework that needs to be done, and contacting some of these experts, such as Ivan and George, from time to time, to make sure that you can get an expert view on some of your reports. Feel free to reach out to them anytime. I hope you guys don't mind. Ivan and George, they can reach out to you at all times, isn't it? Excellent, great.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Super. So we're exactly 1 minute after time. I think we should stop at this point. And once again, thank you so much, CIAT. Shall I, on behalf of Internews, also send our regards to the Global Center for Media Development. Partly, they also partly sponsored today's webinar, as well as to all our colleagues in the CGIAR system who in one way or the other contributed to make this happen. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch for those of you in Kenya. In Nigeria, I suspect that Michael is still getting ready to go to lunch because it's just about 11 o'clock. And I suspect there's no more to say from my end. Ivan, any last word, George, or shall we close here?
Thank you very much.
To say thank you very much, and if you have any questions, we're happy to follow up after.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.